Welcome, everyone. I think we have a few people still grabbing some soup, but in the interest of time, and I can't wait to hear from our speaker, I just wanted to jump in. So feel free as you're here today. There's going to be extra food. Go back and grab some seconds, absolutely. So my name is Pam Costi. I'm co-chair with Rebecca Pulse of the Biodiversity Project here at MLUC. And I want to share 3 quick items before Christy Perry introduces our speaker today. So one item, what you might have been noticing, we have a tree behind us. And there's just a couple of leaves on that tree. And you may wonder why it's paltry. Well, we are asking every member of the church to consider making a commitment. Those leaves represent early commitments to plant 1 native, or if you're past your planting age, to then give a native to somebody to plant, so that all of us can help in the biodiversity project. And as you do, these are the leaves. You can find them at our biodiversity table. As you make that commitment, put in a leaf, and we're going to all see this tree grow and blossom, and it will be our visual understanding of our working together to help the planet. So please get a leaf. Thank you. Speaking of how the heck am I going to do that? Is he here? Is Mark Inver here? So Mark dropped these off to me today. They're 30 milkweed seeds, and he said share. I'm like, what timing? So if you're thinking, well, I don't know how I'm going to get started. We've got 30 milkweed seeds. Take one, share it, or plant it. And somebody was going to help with the distribution. Carolyn, you want to pass those out? So that's just a... So she'll be passing them out. Take one if you can use it. All right, second, I just wanted you to mark your calendar if you're enjoying food today and good information. Mark your calendar for next week's program. Same time, same room, same great food. Well, different food, but same great food. It's going to be Nature's Best Hope is You, an introduction to Homegrown National Park. We're going to have a short video and a Nature's Best Hope discussion. Whether you've read the book or starting the book, we've got the amazing Leslie Bass and Christy Perry to lead the discussion. So please plan to come out, and we'll be learning and growing together. And finally, if you enjoyed the food today and you want food next week, we need some volunteers. So we're going to pass this out. We need soups, breads, and spreads, and fruits. Just a few folks will make for a wonderful program. So I guess Rebecca will send that out. So that were my 3 little spots. We'll be telling you more about programming in April. We're going to have a huge Earth Day. In May, we're going to start doing some community projects outside, helping in the community with our newfound knowledge and our helping hands. So now I'd like to ask Christy Perry, our awesome member of the Biodiversity Committee, to introduce our speaker today. Christy?
Thank you. Hello. So, Michelle Detwiler is the owner of Wild About Native Plants in Penn Valley. She's a native plant consultant and ecological planting designer. She believes in the art and science of ecological gardening to inform a modern, intelligent, and compassionate approach to landscape stewardship through the use of native plants, unique in their capacities to support native insects, birds, and other animals. She believes that humans can help preserve Earth's diminishing biodiversity by re-envisioning residential, commercial, and public landscapes. Michelle has a BA and MA in biology, as well as continuing education in an impressive list of 17 other related fields. She is a Pennsylvania Master Naturalist Program volunteer and the president of her local civic association. In 2023, she received the Go for the Green Award for her longtime efforts in community education in the Lower Merion Township and the borough of Narberth. She's one of many busy bees across the country in the Homegrown National Park movement. and has been the catalyst for acres and acres of ecologically valuable spaces being added to the collective homegrown national park. And if you're curious, that park is now over 106,000 acres from about 44,000 people like you and me, choosing to transform some of their property to native. And she can help you with just about anything you want to accomplish in this field. Thank you for being here today, and please join me in welcoming Michelle Detwiler.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is an honor to be here. I'm really inspired by everything that you're doing on your campus and to share the message, and I appreciate that really generous introduction from Christy. I think I'm going to stand down here, if you don't mind, to point to the slides. And I'm excited to share with you today tips on making our landscapes more bird-friendly, and also tell you about the Pollinator Pathway, which is very similar to Homegrown National Park, which Christy just mentioned, which is an experiment to sort of knit our spaces together with habitat for the benefit of wildlife. Know while I'm talking today that everything we do for birds and other wildlife we do for ourselves, because as you know, humans depend on healthy ecosystems also. So I'm going to focus mostly on habitat, but there are a tremendous number of things you can do to help birds that have nothing to do with habitat. One is to keep cats indoors, and this is because they're non-native predators and they sort of kill 1 billion birds every year in this country alone. And we can't afford to lose any more of our birds because we've lost 3 billion breeding birds since the 1970s when scientists look at the data. You can also think about where you get your coffee from, where it's sourced. A lot of coffee is open grown in Central America, where they have to cut down the tropical forest, the native habitat for the neotropical birds that overwinter there, in order to grow coffee to meet demand. So if you can find coffee that has a Smithsonian bird-friendly certification or a rainforest certification, then you're supporting farms that also support more habitat for birds while they're growing the coffee at the same time. And of course, those birds come to our area to breed, like our scarlet tanagers and our Baltimore orioles and the warblers. Another thing that you can do is reduce plastic use. Single-use plastics contribute to the over 17 billion tons of plastic that enter the oceans every year around the globe. And birds, shorebirds particularly, will consume the plastic or regurgitate it to their young to feed them. So reducing plastic helps all of those wonderful shorebird species. Okay, so focusing on habitat, we can help birds in a very thoughtful way by thinking about all of their different life stages, how they nest, how they raise their young, how they migrate, where they overwinter. And so this is a wren on my porch, and you'll notice that she's feeding her young a soft-bodied insect. And if you're not familiar with why native plants matter, this is largely the reason. It's because the leaves of the native plants can support lots and lots of caterpillars in particular, and other insects. They evolved alongside of our insects over thousands of years, so the leaf chemistry is different than non-native plants. And it turns out that birds need thousands of insects to raise their young. Doug Tallamy, an entomologist at the University of Delaware, is the one that created this light bulb moment for many of us in explaining why plants matter so much to animals. So it's wonderful that you're reading one of his books, Nature's Best Hope, and talking about it. His first book is what inspired many of us, called Bringing Nature Home. If you're continuing to be interested, I recommend reading that one as well, because the birds not only need thousands of insects in order to fledge the nest successfully, but they need thousands more after they fledge in order to make it to adulthood. So if the parents can go out every 3 minutes and grab caterpillars on nearby native plants, it's a lot easier for those young to make it to adulthood. This is a caterpillar in my yard near my compost bin on one of our native grapevines. And this sort of drives the point home about what it needs to eat. So its mother flew around looking for what we call its host plant, which is this native grapevine. And she laid her eggs on the grapevine. She also could have laid them on Virginia creeper, because that's another host plant for this particular caterpillar. And then when that caterpillar hatched, it was able to eat that grapevine and grow rapidly, make a cocoon, and then emerge as an adult form known as a Pandora sphinx moth, a beautiful large moth species that you would see if you went out in twilight and looked at your milkweed flowers or your phlox flowers. You would see the adult nectaring. So the adults need nectar, but the young, the larval stage, need those native plants. And so it can either, with the native plants, it can either make it to adulthood to be a nighttime pollinator, or it can be part of the food web in terms of feeding birds in the larval stage. So it turns out that some native plants are better than others at supporting these caterpillar species, and we call them keystone species. So this is an example of a native maple tree, and this is one of our keystone species because it supports more species of caterpillars than other plants. So this rosy maple moth looks for this plant, lays her eggs right on one of the leaves hatch and become this caterpillar, form that cocoon, often overwinter in the leaves or in the soil, and then emerge to be next season's rosy maple moths. So if we put more of these kinds of plants, which we call keystone plants, we'll have more of these insects that feed the birds and the rest of the food web. So it turns out that 14% of native plants are supporting 90% of the caterpillars, and that's why caterpillar species, and that's why we call them keystone plants. You can find a list of these plants if you visit the National Wildlife Federation website. You can just Google Native Plant Finder. You put in your zip code, and then it will generate a list of plants that are very valuable in your space. I have done that for us already, and this is the list of the top 30 most valuable locally keystone plants. So if you're getting started with planting in your space, you might think about incorporating these first because they're the most valuable. And feel free to take a picture of any of these slides that would be helpful to you. But you'll notice they're ranked in order. So the first one are our oaks. They support over 500 species of caterpillars. The next most important are our native cherries and our willows and our birches and our blueberries and our hickories and our pines. You'll notice that because we live in the eastern deciduous forest, we live in an ecoregion called the Northern Piedmont of southeastern Pennsylvania, most of our really valuable plants tend to be woodies, shrubs and trees in terms of supporting wildlife. There are some like goldenrods and asters that are also really, really valuable. So while I'm on this slide, I'll just mention that the other definition of keystone plants are plants that support specialist bees that only eat the pollen of certain plants. So just like a lot of caterpillars are very specific about the leaves that they can use, some bees are also very specific about the pollen that they can eat. There's a difference in pollen chemistry as well. So that's why you see the little bee notation here next to willows. Willows are very important for specialist bees, as are asters and goldenrods. I want to tell you about a few of these specifically. This is our oak genus, supporting over 500 species of caterpillars. This is a beautiful one at the Laurel Hill Cemetery. This was sort of open grown, so you have that big branching pattern with some lovely plantings beneath it. This is what they look like when they grow in the woods. I happen to live on a woodland, which has been my teacher, and I'm very grateful for it. This is a red oak. This is a white oak with that sort of lighter bark there, and this is a black oak. And these are part of the remnant oak hickory forest where we live. Even if you live on cleared land, you'll still see whispers of that original plant community that sort of anchor us and give us a sense of place of where we live, and also support tremendous amount of wildlife. So white oaks can be very beautiful when they're young. This is one planted in a nearby park. Look at that beautiful red color. They're fun to watch grow. So sometimes people hesitate to introduce them because they think they grow slowly. But the benefit of putting in a small tree is that you can see it up close. You can really see those leaves and watch the buds and the growth of the tree. If you have a dry site or an average site, a white oak is one of the best things that you can put in your space. If you happen to have a wetter site, there are other oaks that you could use, like a swamp white oak. This is a park in our area. This is a really tough tree that can take more pollution than the white oak, so you can put it in a parking lot, you can put it along a road, you can put it in a very wet area. And this is a reminder to really assess your site conditions before you pick plants. Be really realistic about how much sun you have, how much moisture you have, and so forth. I just visited the Race Street Pier that has a tremendous number of swamp white oaks planted, and they are just beautiful and tough right along the water in Philadelphia if you're interested in seeing a big group of them. This is chestnut oak, which is a wonderful tree if you have a dry hillside. Super, super dry. It has that really neat bark. If you're hiking, you can touch it, get close to it. And it has a kind of a tall, narrow canopy. So if you have a dry site, a chestnut oak is a great choice. And the ones I just mentioned, the last 3 species, are all in the white oak family. So they're less prone to disease than the red oak family. So I tend to recommend those. So those are oaks. That's our #1 keystone species. The next one in our area are our native cherries. These are very easy because they pop up on their own. So these are not the cherries that you see in spring that have the pink blooms. Those are non-native cherry trees. Our native cherry trees will often just pop up on roadsides or disturbed soil. They can be sort of an understory tree, although they'll get very big, and they have white blooms that will look closer at those blooms. This is what the blooms look like. So they're great for pollinators in the spring. The leaves are hosting all of those caterpillars, and then those blooms will produce berries that are great for the birds later in the season. So if you see tree saplings coming up on your property, if you can figure out what they are, what species they are, you can choose to leave them. These are often gifts of nature, but we tend to discount them because we don't plant them ourselves. But we can reforest or create a little woodland by allowing some of these saplings to come up. So that reminds me to tell you about some plant apps if you're open to that, because these can help you to identify what's coming up on your property. That's the hardest thing. When you see a little tree sapling, you can take a picture with either iNaturalist or Picture This. These are 2 different apps, or another app of your choice. Even Google now, if you take a picture, it'll give you an idea of the species that you might be seeing. It's not always right, but it'll get you close. And then you can leave it. If you have deer, you would maybe put a cage around it to protect it. And then you will have a very well-established tree in a few years that's providing a lot of wildlife value. We also have smaller trees in the Prunus genus, in the cherry and plum genus, in case you're not interested in a larger tree. This is our American plum. You don't see it for sale very much, but you can find it at native plant nurseries. It's a lovely small tree, and it blooms very, very early. See those beautiful white blooms? These are really valuable, not only to the birds who are gleaning the insects off the leaves, but also to the early season bees. The bumblebees in particular come out very early, the queens. They've overwintered by themselves, and they need flowers in the early season to collect nectar to get their broods going, which you see later in your sunny pollinator gardens in the summer. So American plum is wonderful for sun to part sun. And then also we have smaller cherries, this one's called choke cherry, if you're interested in a smaller cherry. The other genus I want to touch on is a perennial genus. These are our goldenrods. Has everybody heard of goldenrods? Yes, okay. This is the great American wildflower, yellow blooming, that you see in the fall along roadsides and old fields. It doesn't cause allergies like it's often associated with, because it has very heavy pollen. The pollen is transferred by bees. It doesn't blow on the wind. And mostly what gives you allergies are plants that have pollen that blow on the wind. Ragweed blooms about the same time, and that is wind pollinated, so that's often what's causing the allergies, but goldenrod gets blamed. So that's my advocacy for the goldenrods, but this is the #1 pollinator plant in our area, and the #1 perennial plant. The plants that come up and flower but then die back to the ground that don't have a woody structure, we call those perennials. Most important keystone perennial plant. So this is one that's really easy to introduce in your space. It's called wrinkle leaf goldenrod. It has this wonderful base shape, these beautiful yellow flowers to look forward to later in the season. It mixes well with other plants, so this is growing alongside summer phlox that's still blooming. These are low-growing asters, some native grasses. This happens to be at the Mount Cuba Center, which is in Hockessin, Delaware. And if you haven't visited, I highly encourage you to. They display native plants in the landscape and show you how to use them. And they're focused mostly on our ecoregion. So there are lots of examples there. You can see that this is a naturalistic style of planting where plantings go in very densely and layered. So that creates habitat. It also creates less maintenance for humans because there's less weeding to do. There's no space for weeds to come up, and you don't need to apply yearly applications of mulch. And that's the goal for me, is always to have enough plants so you don't have to continually add wood mulch. This is a wonderful native bumblebee enjoying the nectar of that same plant, of that wrinkle leaf goldenrod. And an example of the goldenrod growing with one of our native asters, aromatic aster, alongside other perennial keystone species, including perennial sunflowers, which we have some, and rudbeckia, which is great for the specialist bees. This was a garden that I worked on when my kids were in elementary school as a volunteer project. So this is kind of a summary of some of the most important plants that I just mentioned to you, keystone plants, the oaks, the cherries, willows, birches, dogwoods. These are woody keystone species over here, and then perennial keystone species here, different kinds of goldenrods, asters, and sunflowers, for example. And even if you have shade, there are species that work in the shade for these, for goldenrods and asters, for example. So know that. Feel free to take a picture if you want to of that one. Okay, so another way to think about supporting birds, besides providing the caterpillars for the leaves for nesting, is to think about their migration. So some birds migrate thousands of miles, and it's a very dangerous journey. It's the most dangerous event in their whole lives. A lot of them die. And it's amazing to think about the mechanical energy required to get that far without assist, you know, and for these tiny little creatures. So they need food along the way. This is an example of an eastern wood pewee. It's sitting on one of my deer cages. It hunts insects, so it likes these perches. And you can see that it overwinters in northern and western South America. It migrates through Mexico, sometimes across the Gulf of Mexico, but usually over land, and it comes to raise its young in our area. You ask, why would birds do this? Why would they make this dangerous journey and come so far and spend all this energy? They think they partly do it because we have such a flush of insects in the spring. Partly because we used to have glaciers, which left a lot of rich soils which support those insects. So it's a reminder to take care of our soils and our insects and to try to keep the chemicals off of our landscapes for that reason. So in supporting that bird, we can provide resources, food along the way. And these are often birds that you will not see or be able to support at bird feeders. They're just not as attracted to them, and they really need insects, not seeds. So this is a little warbler. I'm looking out my kitchen window, and it's such an honor to see one of these birds. I get really excited during migration to try to see species that I wouldn't see at other times of year. So she came up to raise her young in the north, in North America, and she's stopped over in my space to glean insects off the Joe Pye weed. So this is a big, stately plant here that supports a lot of insects, and this is in the late summer, early fall. She's headed back down south to Central America and beyond, but she needs energy along the way. So you can see these birds and you can support these birds if you plant native plants that support the insects, and that's all the plants that we've been talking about today. They call this stopover ecology when they study places that the birds stop over to refuel and to get covered before they head on. And so these are examples of birds that have taken advantage of a stopover in my space, and you could do that with your spaces too. This is a common yellowthroat. This is a female. I do have a little wildlife pond, which is a reminder that water is really valuable to wildlife. They just love it, and will bring more species and support more species. Even if you just have a little bird feeder that you put on the ground, birds and amphibians and all kinds of mammals will be able to use it too. So that's a little yellowthroat. This one might be her partner. This is a male yellowthroat. You have to look very carefully to see them because they're furtive and they're secretive and they like to remain under cover when they come to your space. So you see the vegetation moving and I know to go out and look for a warbler. So a little sparrow here and a little kinglet, adorable little bird that loves insects, sitting on the goldenrod there. So in addition to the insects that the migratory birds can get from your yard, they also appreciate berries. And our native plants, some of them in particular, have really high nutrition for migrating birds. And this is because our plants, a lot of our shrubs and vines, evolved alongside birds that migrate that have these high energy needs, as opposed to non-native shrubs that often evolved in parts of the world that didn't have migrating birds. So their berries of non-native plants often have a lot of sugar content compared to our native shrubs that have a lot of fat and carbs and energy and antioxidants that really support their migration needs because they evolved together. And so I'm going to tell you about a couple of these. These are the most recommended and preferred by the migratory songbirds. I'm going to tell you about a couple of these up here because they're highest on the list. So number one is arrowwood viburnum. This is what it looks like in the spring. It has beautiful flowers. It's a great host plant. And then you can use it. It's also very adaptable in different conditions. So I mentioned being really practical about where you put plants in terms of sun and shade and moisture. This one is very forgiving, so you're likely to be successful with it regardless of where you put it. It'll grow in the sun, it'll grow in the shade like this, it'll grow in moist conditions and dry conditions. It can be used as a hedge if you need privacy screening, for example, a big lush shrub, and then it makes these berries, and these are what we're talking about in terms of late summer, fall, supporting those migratory birds with really high nutrition berries. This is another shrub that I recommend, which is a gray dogwood. This was third on the list behind Virginia creeper, interestingly, on our previous list. Which is a vine. And this one is related to red twig dogwood, which you might be familiar with, also really, really great. And you can plant these in thickets. So if you plant a bunch of them, if you have the space, it's very valuable to birds because you get huge biomass. They can take cover, they can nest in the stems, and then they have these wonderful nutritious berries during migration season. This one will grow in sun to part sun and dry to moist conditions, so also very forgiving. And I show you this. This is at the back of my driveway on the edge of the woods where I live. This looks very complex. It's very unreadable at first. So what I did was draw in some of the species here to give you a feeling of the layers that are here. So in the woods, I have native beech and oaks as overstory trees, for example. There are some black gums as understory trees, some native dogwoods, which are wonderful also. And then I introduced at the edge of the woodland in layers other shrubs. The gray dogwood that we talked about is here, another thicket of them back here. I also added another keystone plant, a willow, a shrub willow, which is really, really valuable. Again, stepping down the layers from the tall canopy trees to the shorter understory trees to shrubs. And then in the front is where the perennials are. It's a little bit more sunny there. So I let the white snakeroot grow, which you see all over in the fall. It's often treated as a weed, but it's a native plant that's really great a nectar source for a lot of insects. I also have milkweed here and Joe Pye weed, all those other great things. So you can take inspiration for this for small spaces or larger spaces, adding layers of habitat that will support different creatures in those different layers, including birds that like different layers to nest in, for example. These are other native plants that produce really valuable berries. They're also gorgeous, as you can see. One of them is also treated like a weed, this pokeweed. Does anybody recognize pokeweed or know about pokeweed? Yes, okay. That one it's actually very beautiful, but it does seed around like crazy, and it's very difficult to remove. It supports a tremendous number of birds, though. So if you can leave it on a wild edge, you'll be doing a lot of good for the bird species that just love it, like gray catbirds. They love fruit, so you'll see and be able to support those if you leave some of your pokeweed. Food for winter birds. So not all birds migrate. A lot of birds try to make it in the winter where we live. Some of those are short distance migrants. So the robins that you see in the winter are often not the robins you saw during the growing season. They migrated a little bit further south, and we are their overwintering area. So to support them, we can include berrying shrubs that hold onto their berries longer into the winter, like winterberry holly. And that's what this one is here. So the robins enjoying the winterberry hollies for winter food. We also have birds that really appreciate seeds, like our American goldfinches. And you'll see these beautiful yellow birds all season here. They're particularly love seeds. And if you leave the stems over the winter, you'll be able to help feed them. I notice you've done a great job with that in your parking lot gardens. I see your standing seed heads there. That's the thing to do. And in traditional horticulture, that is not what has been done. People have cut them down in the fall, sort of thinking that winter was not a season in the garden. But we now recognize winter is a season in the garden for us. We can see the textural beauty of these seed heads, and also for the birds. It's a really important source of food for them, and then you get to bring wildlife to your space. I think the winter garden looks beautiful. These are aster seed heads. Look at the winter light coming through those. Why would we cut that down for 5 months of the year? You know, leave it standing for food and for cover for these birds, the goldfinches that love it. And then consider leaving other dead plant material in your spaces too. Dead plant material of all kinds, seed heads, stems, dead wood, brush piles. These are all really important parts of nature, and we tend to remove too much of them. So this is an example of stems that I left of this plant, which has the new growth coming up in the spring. This is Eastern Blue Star. You can see it has the blue flowers, but I left the old stems, and I'll leave them indefinitely without ever cutting them all the way to the ground, partly because I know 30% of our bee species need stems to nest in. So if I treat that like trash and throw it away, or compost it right away, I'm throwing away the next season's bees. That might be inside there without me knowing. The other thing that's interesting about this, I got to witness this little bird here. Can you see her? She has kind of an orangish cast to her. Does anybody know what kind of bird that is? Can you see it well enough? Yes, it's a Baltimore Oriole. Yes, so if you were thinking that, that is correct. This is one of those neotropical migrants that comes very far to nest in our area. You don't see them too often, but I watched her strip the fibers from these old stems to use it to make her nest. She just kept coming back to strip the fibers. Milkweed's another one that has a lot of great fibers also for birds. So there are many reasons to leave dead plant material standing and just let the new growth come right up through it in the next year. This is a little robin in the winter. She's eyeing the ground because she's looking for insects beneath the leaves. So this is a reminder to leave leaves wherever you can in your landscape. The leaves temper the soil moisture, and they provide for all of the insects, billions of microorganisms living in the soil, insects that are feeding the birds, and things that are going to emerge for the next season. If you want to see more fireflies in your space in following summers, you leave more leaves. This is interesting, yes, because the fireflies have different life stages. This is a firefly larva. This is what they look like for most of their lives. They live 1 year to 2 in moist soil. So you can't have moist soil where you remove leaves. The ground just sort of desiccates. It's exposed. So where you leave leaves, you feed the microorganisms, you retain soil moisture, and you support things like firefly larvae that are living there. And we have lots of species of fireflies. So, and then here's a caterpillar that's moving into the leaves to overwinter. So that's also what you're supporting with the leaves, are the caterpillars that as adults or eggs or cocoons are trying to find cover in the soil or right at the soil surface underneath the leaves. And this is true with our native bees that are trying to overwinter as well. You also will not have toads in your garden unless you leave leaves. So this is with my wildlife pond, they really like my space, so they come out to breed in the spring, and then they hunt insects all summer as part of the food web in the garden. And then in the winter, they create little holes in the ground, and they dig in with their hind legs, and then they have all that cover of the leaves and the pine needles to help them overwinter, temper that soil temperature throughout the winter, and then they emerge the next season. So helping the amphibians is a great thing to do in our spaces as well. I've mostly focused on habitat. I hope you've gotten a lot out of that. Now I'd like to focus on just our general infrastructure. So if you were to do nothing else in your yard, nothing that I just mentioned with introducing plants or anything else, if you could begin to protect your windows or do some of these other things that I'm going to mention, you will make a huge impact. We have 1 billion birds are killed every year with bird collisions in this country. That is a lot of birds. If you imagine one bird hitting every house in America, how many birds that would accidentally kill. And they don't necessarily die right away. They often hemorrhage later, unfortunately. And so if you're not at home, you may not realize that they're hitting your windows, but birds do not recognize glass. Either they see nothing and they try to fly right through it, or they see a reflection of habitat, like this tree, and they try to fly into the tree. So you can see why it's a huge problem for them. This is something we actually know how to solve, but we've chosen not to so far. So if you can be part of the solution, even in a small way, it will help a lot. For example, if you have a window where you know that the birds are colliding very often, you can make that window more visible to them. If you don't have time to do all the windows, or, you know. So you can also look for places where you see smudges. That will give you an idea of where they might be hitting. And interestingly, we think about high-rise buildings killing most of the birds, but it's really our homes and low-rise buildings that are accidentally killing 99% of the species. Often when weather is bad and they're moving through our landscapes, they drop down lower to fly to get out of the bad weather. And then they collide with our windows. This is an organization in Philly called Bird Safe Philly, if you don't already know about them. They have a great mission to educate about this. They go out at 5 in the morning and they look for birds that have hit windows in Philadelphia, and they try to tag those and raise awareness about what's happened overnight. A lot of birds migrate at night, so you find them on the ground in the morning. Unfortunately, there was a horrible incident at McCormick Place in Chicago where they killed hundreds and hundreds of migrating birds, and it was really devastating. So since then, they've retrofitted their windows with this bird safe film. It's a plastic film that has little dots that are very close together that allow the birds to see the glass, and so they fly away from it knowing that there's an obstacle that they can't get through. And the dots have to be very close together, like 2 to 3 inches apart, otherwise the smaller birds will still try to fly through. So that was sort of a success story for that building. We can do that in our homes too by just marking the windows with something. So this is my front porch, and this window I know was killing birds, and so I just took a glass marker that has washable paint, and I just dotted the window. And you can do this very quickly if you want to avoid using the plastic. Then when you wash the window, you can wash it all off and then dot it again. It's very quick, but it allows the birds to see the window. And here, I dotted the upper portions of these panes. I didn't do the bottom because of the screen there. They tend to not die when they hit the screens. So I immediately felt relief knowing that I wasn't going to contribute to any more bird deaths with that. And this is a reminder that you have to put the dots on the outside of the window. If you do it from the inside, they can't see it. So it has to be on the outside. And the decals that they sell don't work very well because, again, they need to be closer together. You really need the dots. And one is called bird-friendly, what is it? If you look up bird-friendly dots or window protection, you'll find different groups that sell things. This is what the window looks like in my kitchen in the winter when I'm looking out, just to try to convince you that it doesn't really obscure the view too much. I think people have not protected their windows because they feel like it's going to obscure the view, and I really don't notice it. You get used to it, and it's not a really big deal. So. This is a client of mine who protected her own windows. She hung strings. This is another way to do it. You can hang things like this if you want to. She put a little piece of wood up there and hung the strings. At the top, she used the bird-friendly tape there where she couldn't do the strings. You can also just mark them up with acrylic paint if you're open to doing that. Just anything so the birds can see the windows. The other thing that we can do to really help them is to reduce light, both indoors and outdoors. This is really important during migration season. So like starting right now, March through May, the spring migration when they're coming up from the south, and then also August through October when they're heading back down south. And this is because they often get confused by light and they will follow it. So if they come to light sources, they'll accidentally hit windows, for example. If you haven't seen a light pollution map in a while, this is kind of what it looks like. It used to look like this in the 1950s, and now 99% of the United States live under light-polluted skies. We can't see the Milky Way anymore, and this is affecting so many of our organisms, in addition to being a waste. But if you think about fireflies again, many fireflies and bats and moths, they evolved with the night sky, and they need the night sky in order to see each other to reproduce. The fireflies, for example. So if we obscure that with too much light, they can't find each other for mating. The moths will often fly to light indefinitely and will exhaust themselves. They're really, really important part of the food web, are moths. So that's not good. And this is a reminder of the Atlantic flyway where we live, where these birds are flying huge, very, very, very long distances. And so in thinking about and cooperating with our neighbors, reducing light can really help them. This was a study from Biological Conservation that showed that light coming from the inside was one of the most important factors affecting bird collisions. So it's really important to turn off your outdoor lights, of course, when you can, but keeping the lights off inside or closing the curtains during migration will prevent a lot of collisions so that they're not flying toward the glass when they see the light. So one bird that's migrating right now is the American woodcock, which is a beautiful sort of wetland forest edge bird. And they found one in Philly that hit the window, so if you could just turn your lights off starting now at night, it'd be really, really helpful. And this is an example of a light that I need to turn off inside my own house or close the curtains there. So this is just another reminder of turning off those lights during migration. And also, you can change the light bulbs in your outdoor lights to be warmer colors. The birds are not as drawn to the warm colors as they are to the bright white. So orange or even red really helps them if you need to keep a light on outside. And also, you can put your lights on motion detectors, so they're not on all night, but they come on when you need them. Somebody walks by, they come on, and then they go off. You saved energy, money, you haven't contributed to climate change as much, and you're saving the birds. And then lastly, it's really important to avoid pesticides on our properties. If you're familiar with how many pesticides are out there in the agricultural industry, they're just everywhere. And so we don't want to create native gardens and then draw the insects in and then accidentally kill them all. So that's why it's really important to avoid spraying for mosquitoes. And of course, the intention is good in spraying for mosquitoes, but these are not selective chemicals. They kill all of the insects, unfortunately, most of which you can't see because they're on the leaves. The best way to control mosquitoes is to control them at the larval stage anyway in standing water. And so I recommend Colin Purington's website. He has a lot of ideas for eliminating stagnant water. And we feel like we hear that, we feel like, well, we don't have any standing water, but there are all kinds of places that you don't think of that will have it, like gutters that aren't cleaned out. All it takes is a tablespoon of water for them to breed, or a downspout where water is sitting. So if you can eliminate those, and there are other ways to handle it too, instead of spraying, you'll be creating a safer space for the birds. If you do spray, you're eliminating all of the life that's necessary to feed the birds. So keep that in mind. And you can visit the American Bird Conservancy if you'd like to share this information with your neighbors, for example. So pivoting a little bit, Christy mentioned Homegrown National Park, which is a national movement to add habitat, like we've been talking about, for birds and for insects to our spaces. The Pollinator Pathway is another one, and this sort of came along before Homegrown National Park, so I got a little bit involved because it was exciting to me. And the idea is that we do what we're talking about today on individual spaces so that we can create a corridor of habitat to reconnect our spaces. So a pathway is sort of a corridor of healthy habitat that bees and birds and mammals can move through. The problem is we've fragmented so many of our landscapes with our roads and our infrastructure, and and with our clearing. So we've taken away a lot of that habitat. So by putting it back in individual spaces, we can begin to provide for those insects and birds. The principles of the Pollinator Pathway are everything that we've been talking about: incorporating native plants, keeping pesticides at a minimum, leaving all that winter habitat, the stems and the seed heads and so forth, and then trying to remove invasive species or species that do ecological harm over time. So people do this sort of on their honor, and the reason that we do this is because we have so many species to protect. We have 437 native bee species in Pennsylvania. This does not include the non-native honeybee, for example. We just have a huge diversity. And then we have 350 native moth species that we've been talking about that are so important as bird food, and these are also our most important nighttime pollinators. This is an example of how far some of our native bees fly in order to provision their nest. So if they can't find forage, flowers with nectar and pollen year-round, or when they're nesting, they won't be able to successfully nest. So you can see that bumblebees, they're quite big and they're capable of flying a long distance, up to 5 miles. Of course, if they have to fly 5 miles to provision their nest, it's going to be a lot harder to have a successful brood. But something like our small carpenter bee, which almost looks like a fly, it only flies a few yards. It needs resources very nearby. So the more that we can provide in our individual spaces, connecting with our neighbors, the more successful these species will be that have a diversity of needs in terms of distance to collect resources. And this is Heather Holmes' information from Pollinators Native Plants, which I encourage you to look at. She's wonderful. This is a reminder of why we need to do this very desperately. I'm sure you've heard of a lot of the statistics of wildlife disappearing around the planet, but part of the reason is how we do agriculture. We use a lot of Roundup-ready crops now, so we're spraying even wild edges where milkweed used to grow, for example. We've removed the forest and we didn't put the native plants back where we built our infrastructure. We put a lot of non-native plants like barberry and privet and non-native dogwoods, for example, that don't support those insects and the birds like our native plants do. And there are so many of us now that it really matters that we not just preserve our national parks, but also put the habitat back right in our spaces that we have control over. And so the idea of the pathway is that gardens in Narberth could be connected to the gardens in West Mill Creek Park, and over here to maybe Beaumont and Stoneleigh, and out to you all here in Devon, so that bees and birds and butterflies can find resources in a connected way all along the way. And this is what the Pollinator Pathway sign looks like. It's just a little 6-inch sign. It says native plants, pesticide-free. If you want to demonstrate what a project you're doing, or to neighbors, for example. And this is what it looks like where I live right now in Lower Merion. Every butterfly you see on there is somebody that signed up to be on the pathway and to implement those principles that we've talked about. There are 170 properties now, which is really exciting, commercial properties and schools and traffic islands and religious institutions and homes. This is what the map looked like when I first noticed it in 2020. It was just in New York and Connecticut. And people were really getting on board there. And so I started the first one in Pennsylvania, or brought awareness to the project in Pennsylvania. And so now you can see that it's in our area, but also down into Wilmington, Delaware, and Baltimore, and actually across the country now. So it's a really exciting grassroots movement that you can participate in, or you can just implement the principles. These are some of the others in Pennsylvania, in Media and Center City. This is what it looks like in our page in our area. The Lower Merion Conservancy hosts our program. It's actually very casual. People just sign up on their own on the national website. They have a wonderful newsletter. They have online speakers that for resources and things. As does Homegrown National Park. And Homegrown National Park, I encourage you to join as well, or instead of. They have the very similar goals. And so here's again the website, if you're interested in that, the pollinatorpathway.org. And I thought I'd show you a few gardens that are on the pathway that are doing everything that we're talking about. This used to be lawn in a residential space near me, and now it's beautiful. This happens to be in the summer, beautiful lush gardens there, and a property. This is a client of mine. We removed all the grass and created more of an experience here through layered native plantings in kind of a shady area. So replacing lawn is a great way to go, lawn that you're not using, for example. This is another lawn replacement area in a front yard in Gladwin, just a huge organic shaped oval here. We did trees and shrubs and perennials. This happens to be in the late summer, also on the Pollinator Pathway. This is my front entrance. I consider it sort of a conservation landscape. I have hardly any grass left, just enough to throw the ball with the dog and for the kids to play. And I put no chemicals on it. I call it a freedom lawn and just let everything grow that wants to grow. Violets and just mow what's left. So there are no chemicals, and I let plants come in that are naturally occurring, like all of the oaks and the trees and the spice bush, and then I introduce native asters and sumacs and things like that. So I partner with nature in that way, which I encourage you to do too. This is a reminder, this is a property near South Ardmore Park near me, and this is a reminder that humans are part of nature and gardens are for humans too. A lot of people think you need to keep a lot of lawn for children, but children are tremendously enriched playing in garden spaces here at Kate's house. This is an entry garden to West Mill Creek Park, a public park that they converted to a wildlife garden that's on the Pollinator Pathway. I happen to design the front entry gardens, which are all native. And you can see the goldenrods blooming there. This is a church property. This is Overbrook Presbyterian in Philadelphia. This was a scout project where they removed grass and introduced native plantings and then put the property on the Pollinator Pathway. This is another church property, a Presbyterian church that introduced plantings all around the play yard for the preschool children. The children were only allowed to play in sort of the asphalt area previously, and now they enjoy the plantings so much they come out to make fairy gardens, and so it's just very, very sweet. And even just a few plantings around the edges go a long way in terms of enriching their experience. This is the Narberth entry to the Narberth Post Office, where they're starting to do plantings with a little Pollinator Pathway sign there. This is the train station in Narberth that doubles as a monarch way station. If you include milkweed, you can support the monarchs that really, really need our support. They're on their way out. Their numbers are so low. This is a traffic island that I take care of, that I introduce native plants to. Here you can see the asters blooming in the fall. Here is the Belmont Hills Library, and we converted all of the non-native plantings, liriope and so forth, to native plantings. And so I work on this with a mural artist from Philadelphia on a volunteer basis to plant and take care of it. Here's what it looks like when you're returning your library books. You get to see all the asters blooming. This is what it looks like in fall. It's very lush. It's planted densely, so we don't have to weed as much. And it has flowers, native flowers, coming up all season long. And we've since added plaques or tags that show what each of the plants are. So if you're working on this in your own space, know that you're not alone. There are a lot of people working on things in the community. And I leave you with a view of my garden in the late summer with the giant sunflowers here that the bees are loving, and some resources, and just a reminder that providing habitat and creating habitat is also very beautiful for us. And I thank you for having me. And I would be glad to take questions if you have any. Okay, I think they're gonna, Anders or Pam is gonna pass around the microphone here.
Okay, I'll go first.
Okay.
I tend to leave my Joe Pye weed and my goldenrod and stuff over the winter, but then I have tended to cut them back. Now, is that okay if in the next couple of weeks
Yeah.
I can get outside and
Yes.
to make room for them to grow again?
Yes, so that's a very good question. It's okay to cut them back. What I would encourage you to do is leave 10 to 12 inches of stem, because there will be bees, there can be bees already nesting in those stems.
I've read half of the book, so I've gotten to that point.
Yeah.
But I just, at some point you have to cut down the stuff from the year before.
Well, if you think about it happening in nature, nature will cull on its own, so the stems will fall over, but it doesn't have to be cut all the way to the ground. If you find you need to cut it, I encourage you to leave some, because most bees nest within a foot of the ground. So if you leave that, and bees emerge at different times of year. So if you leave that stem, the dead stem, they can emerge throughout the summer without throwing that species away. And the new growth will just come right up through that.
Okay, I have one more question then I'll pass it.
Yes.
And it has to do with goldenrod, which can get very invasive feeling. And my goldenrod last summer, I ended up chopping it in half halfway through the summer because I couldn't see any of my perennials in back of it. Is that harmful for wildlife?
Okay, so as a reminder, there are a lot of different species of goldenrod.
Mine are big.
You're big. You might have Canada goldenrod. Did they come in on their own?
Yeah.
Okay, so when they come in on their own, they're often Canada goldenrod, which is what you see in fields. And that's a rhizomatous species. It just moves by rhizomes and then keeps popping up. It does decrease the diversity of other things. If you can manage it, I encourage people to leave it. If you can't, I encourage to replace it with species that are more manageable, that don't spread by rhizomes. So there are a lot of different choices with goldenrod species, just for everybody's information. It's okay to cut them back midway. We call that the Chelsea chop. If you cut them between May and June, you can cut your asters and goldenrods back if you feel like they're getting too tall, and allow them to reflush later in the season. Your question about does it harm wildlife? There might be caterpillars on some of those leaves that you've cut off, but if you leave the material that you've cut by the mother plant, the caterpillars can crawl back on. That's an extra detail if that's what you're getting at. But if you find that it's always too tall for you, you might replace it with a different goldenrod species, like the wrinkle leaf goldenrod that I mentioned.
I don't know how on earth I would ever get rid of them.
Get it out, yes. I understand.
They're beautiful.
Yes, they are beautiful, and that particular one is loved by the insects. So I think managing it is a good way to go. If you can't remove, just keep cutting it, and you're fine. Yeah, you're supporting a lot of wildlife otherwise. Yeah. Yes.
Tell me, are you aware of any developments that have come around to this way of managing their space? I live in a development and it's all lawn and mulch. Have you heard of anything nationally?
Oh, I'm having a hard time thinking of one that does it well, because traditional landscaping is part of the problem, unfortunately. There are a lot of practices that are not good for the environment or the local ecology, and it would require a change in business strategy for the landscapers. It would require investing in a little bit more skilled labor or training their labor to handle things differently. But I have seen owners within developments be able to pressure from sort of pressure ownership or the HOAs to allow more planting, for example, or to reduce lawn areas. So it feels like it needs to be grassroots a little bit. People have to demand it, because otherwise they think they're appealing to what people want, a very manicured space that's going to increase their property values and so forth. It looks out of touch for those of us who know what healthy spaces look like. When you see a green lawn, I say, oh, I know they're using a lot of chemicals, so it doesn't look good to me. But so far, not everybody knows that. Yeah. Oh, I'll think about that going forward. That's a great. There are new laws now for HOAs in some states, like Maryland, that say that you cannot be discriminated against for having pollinator gardens in your front yard, because they were trying to control somebody, trying to keep her from having her native gardens in the front. So many problems in the world. I don't know why this has to be one, but there are some. Yeah.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi.
I work at Riverbend, and
Oh,
you helped
yes.
us put in a beautiful native garden. Thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Riverbend is protected by a deer fence, thank goodness. But I'm so impressed that your home is able to support this incredible affluence of wildflowers while even living so close to a forest. So can we talk about deer, and do you have any advice for those of us who everything we plant gets mowed down by the deer?
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you, first of all, for everything that you do at Riverbend to educate children and take care of the land. It's a really great example. Deer are really hard because they are overpopulated, and we don't want to deal with that. But we don't have enough predators, so the whole food system, ecosystem is out of balance. And you might be familiar with the story of reducing deer in Yellowstone, which brought back all of the native habitat for other creatures. So if we favor deer, we disfavor all of the other creatures. One way I do it in my space is I have a lot of caging. So you saw the bird on the cage. I use the black galvanized caging that kind of just blends in. It's a lightweight metal. I protect every new tree I put in because even if they don't eat it, they'll rub it down in the fall. And so I do a lot of protecting. I grow some, there are deer plants that they like less. You know, a lot of our native mints, for example, they can tolerate won't be eaten by the deer. And then there are plants that can tolerate deer browse like Joe Pye weed. They'll eat it at first and then it'll come back and it will still bloom. So that's sort of its superpower. I also have a dog and it has gotten a lot easier since I've had the dog in the front. I don't know if it's the scent that's kept him out of the front yard. The back is just too hard. I have to cage everything that I put in or be really practical about putting in things they don't eat, like native sedges at the ground layer or golden ragwort, really, as you might be familiar with. Some areas have such high deer pressure that they'll eat almost everything. You know, historically, things that they've never eaten before, they'll start to eat, particularly in the winter. So there are sprays and things, as you know, that we can use, but I tend to not do that much myself just because I feel like I'm spraying those leaves that have the insects on them, so I don't know the cost benefit of really doing that. There's also the blood meal that people can use to put on the ground called deer scram. You have to circle your whole area and then you need to put it out when it rains again, so you have to be sort of vigilant, but the smell will sometimes keep them away. And then there's a list of other sprays that they tend to stay away from, but it's very difficult. It limits the plant palette, basically. But a lot of the goldenrods can take deer browse, Joe Pye weed, our native mints, the vernonias, all the New York ironweeds, generally fine, and then protect the woody species. Yeah, so that's a start. Yeah, thank you.
So another pest, what about rats? There ends up being so much construction in Lower Merion, and then the rats come out. And so then if I've been feeding my birds with seeds and things like that, now I feel like I shouldn't be doing that because then that attracts the rats. So what are your thoughts about like how bird seed and all of that with rats?
One thing to do is limit your feeding of the birds just to the winter, because they really don't need it in the summertime. It's fun for us to see them at bird feeders, but it's really sometimes dangerous because we don't clean our bird feeders enough, so they can get diseases from our feeders in the warm season anyway. So it's really not a good idea in the growing season to feed them, but you can feed them in the winter. I've somewhat stopped feeding them altogether, and I would say if you have a rat problem, I would just pull the bird seed out of your landscape for a while.
Like how long would you say?
Well, I don't know exactly, but that they will constantly come if you have that falling from your bird feeder. What I will say is, from personal experience, once you get your native gardens going and you leave all that wonderful plant material in the winter, you will see birds all the time feeding naturally on your landscape. And that's what we ultimately really want. And so the joy doesn't necessarily go away of seeing them. It becomes a little bit more exciting because what you see, you know that you have supported. They're coming because of what you have there. So, yeah, good luck.
I have an area that I fenced in for my blueberry bushes.
Yes.
And I had 4 different oak trees pop up in that area. Should I leave them all there, or should I only leave one there?
Okay, so this is a really good point. This is another way to very inexpensively plant natives or encourage natives in your space. Is if you have deer that are otherwise eating every sapling that comes up, which they do because they're overpopulated, if you put a cage down, you will have trees come up in it, and that's what you're experiencing. You put the caging for a different reason, and the trees are popping up. Do you know, how big is this space?
It runs from the first tree to the 4th tree. It's about, I guess, 5 yards or something like that.
Okay, there's a lot of flexibility with tree spacing. People used to think about providing the entire maximum potential width of a tree for spacing, but you really shouldn't do that these days because we have lots of winds. You know, with climate change, we have a lot of strong events. And so if trees grow closer together, they tend to knit their roots together and are less prone to wind throw. So planting them closer, like 10 feet apart is a good idea even for a big oak tree. What this also does is mimic the way they grow in the forest, where they don't get a big giant canopy that's prone to falling over. They tend to have reduced branching. They still have branching, but reduced all along the trunk, which is the way a tree should be pruned to continue to feed the trunk. And then they'll open up, higher up. So if you're familiar with the new concept of Milwaukee forests, they plant their trees within a couple of feet of each other. They put in tons and tons of saplings, and they let them duke it out like would happen in nature. Some will persist, and some will naturally drop out depending on the circumstances. So you could do that if you want to. You could keep your blueberry bushes for a while because they are shade tolerant to a certain extent, or you could move them and favor the trees, or you could just leave them as layers. Some of the trees are going to drop out on their own. They're very difficult to transplant, the oaks, once they pop up, because they have a taproot this big once the above ground growth is this big. So you can kill them on accident unless you transplant them when they're very, very young. But you could also try to do that if you wanted to. And then if you have a choice of which one to favor, you might favor the white oak species, which have the rounded leaves, which are more likely to persist longer because they're less prone to disease.
It sounds like you answered one of my questions. We have a fenced-in area, used to be a vegetable garden. We're thinking of putting some native plants in there that then the pollinators can circulate freely, even though it's a fenced-in area, it sounds like. Mm-hmm. Is that true? The other question is a little bit broader. The house we live in, and we'll have to move in the near future, I suspect, has some wooded property in the back. Is there a way to conserve that when we eventually have to sell the property? I noticed that a lot of our neighbors have some woods too. I know it depends on the amount of space you have, the conservancy organizations, but is there some way to ensure that some of the things that we do, even planting native plants or the trees in our backyard that are mature, when we sell the property, that it doesn't get totally lawned over and traditional landscaped?
Yes, right. That can be very stressful when investing so much in a space and giving it over to somebody else.
And just the ongoing project of the environment, right?
Yes, right. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of tree protection, so my first thought is what you already mentioned, which is putting a conservation easement on part of it. You'd have to partner with an organization to do that. I don't have too many other ideas beyond that except to leave information for the new owners and to market the house with that information included, so you're maybe drawing the right buyer who appreciates the native planting that you've done. It can increase your house value in that way if you make it known, but I don't know beyond that how to help people understand the value of what you have there.
Right, because it's not a huge property like Stone Lay or anything like that.
Okay.
It's not huge,
Yes.
so but that's a thought we have ahead of time.
Yes, just education is sometimes helpful. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just was wondering if when you go back to the problem of keeping the deer away from sensitive plants,
Yes.
young plants.
Okay.
What about planting around them in such a way that it would make harder for them to reach it, like American holly with its prickly leaves, and grasses, native grasses that have sharp edges, and native mint family perennials such as the hyssop and mountain mint and things like that. Intersperse the more vulnerable plants with these plants. So keep that in mind when you're planting. Of course, it's going to look like a crazy quilt, but it might work.
You can try. You can definitely try. Often it has to be really, really dense if you're trying to protect something, because they will cherry pick like you wouldn't believe. They'll go right over your mint and grab the other one, in my experience, where you have heavy deer pressure. So it doesn't work as well as I wish it did to intersperse the mints, but it's a great idea. It can't be too harmful. I mean, you can try. You can definitely try. And if you have a lower deer pressure, it might work. It just kind of depends on if they're coming right through or not. And you can also put up fencing that's less than 10 feet apart. They will often not jump a double fence. So if you're trying to protect larger areas, you can do 100 feet long and 8 to 10 feet wide, and they will not jump into the area that you're trying to help establish. And so that's one way to do it. But yeah, it can work if you do layers, maybe. If you do shrub layers and you have perennials underneath that they can't get to as easily, they will get to the easy stuff first, as opposed to that. So yeah, that's very strategically a good point. Yeah.
Hi. I have a question. You had mentioned that putting a water source close to the ground would be good to make it a moist area that would attract insects. At the same time, we don't want to have breeding pools for mosquitoes.
Yes, so if you have a water source outside that's not a wildlife pond that would draw dragonfly larvae that eat mosquito larvae in your pond, that's what my pond basically does. You would want to clean it out every 3 days. So there is a maintenance aspect to putting water outside. You don't want it to stand to breed mosquitoes. You need a couple of days. So if you spray it out every 3 days, that would prevent that. Yeah, good question. Okay, anybody else? All right, well, thank you all so much. You were a great audience. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Okay.